You've been getting cheeky lately. Think about your position again. My position? What do you mean by that? Think for yourself a bit. With that, Steve left the house. All I could do was stand there, stunned. I stared at the divorce papers laid before me. Steve's part was already filled in. Guess he wants me to file it, then. Might as well. That was all I could think of in this situation. I hurriedly signed the divorce papers. Steve probably thought pushing the divorce papers on me would make me shrink back. Indeed, the old me might not have been able to do anything at this point. I would have pretended not to know about Steve's affair and just gone along with what he said. But I'm different now. Becoming a mother to Emily and Sarah has made me stronger. Steve has underestimated the strength of a woman who's a mother. He'd better regret his naive understanding. I tucked the signed divorce papers into my pocket with a defiant smile. My name is Shannon, and I'm 43 this year. I work part-time. Needless to say, balancing housework and a job is tough. But I have to work, otherwise, we couldn't make ends meet. That's because most of Steve's salary goes to supporting his parents' living expenses. So, essentially, my part-time income is what supports our family budget. I also have twin daughters, Emily and Sarah, who are in elementary school. I have no choice but to keep going for their sake. Lately, though, I've felt a bit defeated. Handling both housework and my part-time job is just about manageable, but my relationship with Steve has been strained. I thought getting married would make me happy. The reality of my married life is far from what I had imagined, and I often find myself sighing. Looking back, I think I was happiest before I got married. Back then, I never dreamed I would get married. Maybe because I was plain and shy, I hardly ever talked to men. I talked about work with colleagues, but nothing beyond that. Marriage seemed like a distant dream. Relationships with men were stories from another world. But then, a turning point came for me. One day, after work, I stopped by a department store. There happened to be a product fair, and I was casually looking at items when someone spoke to me from behind. "Can I help you find something?" I turned around to see a man standing with good posture. "Oh, no, I was just..." Caught off guard, I couldn't find the right words. Noticing this, he quickly apologized. "I didn't mean to startle you." "No, it's okay. If you'd like, I can show you around. I work for the company that handles these products." As he said this, he began to explain the products to me. That man would later become my husband, Steve. I had hardly ever been approached by men before, so I was completely swept away by his sales pitch. But my reaction seemed unusual to Steve. "Would you like to exchange contact information?" he asked as we were parting. That was the beginning, and we started dating. After that, our relationship progressed smoothly. By the time I got used to dating, we were married. But as soon as we got married, Steve stopped doing anything for me. Before we were married, he used to give me gifts for my birthday and Christmas. But after we got married, he gave me nothing. No flowers, no accessories, not even words of thanks. He left all the housework to me and never helped on his days off. The saying "no need to feed a fish once you've caught it" kept coming to mind. However, there was one time Steve was truly delighted. My pregnancy. "Hey Steve, can we talk for a sec?" "What's up?" "Actually, I went to the doctor today." When I started like that, Steve looked puzzled. He frowned and ostentatiously sighed. "What? Are you sick?" "No, it's different. I'm pregnant." At that moment, the look in Steve's eyes changed. From there, Steve was ecstatic. He called his in-laws, joyfully announcing that they were expecting a child. He also seemed to be calling a friend. Maybe this will bring some change. I was slightly hopeful seeing Steve so happy, but that warmth soon faded. When Emily and Sarah were born, Steve became indifferent again. Even more, he showed no interest in the girls. He only reluctantly helped with taking care of them when asked. "Help out a little, will you? Taking care of twins is twice the work." What? Taking care of the kids is your job, isn't it? It might be, but they're your daughters too, you know? When I said that, Steve turned away. Then he snorted. I wish they had been boys. What? What do you mean? That's exactly what I mean. Steve raised his voice and then shut himself in his room. At that moment, I remembered how Steve had reacted before. He was happy at first, but quickly lost interest. You understand they're not boys, right? I understood why Steve had lost interest. Still, there was nothing I could do about it. In the end, I had to struggle with parenting on my own. One day, after putting Emily and Sarah to bed and returning to the living room to clean up, I suddenly heard voices. I stopped in front of the living room. Please, I'm at my limit. Limit? What was he talking about? Curious, I quietly peeked into the living room. Steve was whispering on the phone, seemingly unaware of my presence. Could it be an affair? Unable to stay still, I waited for a chance to enter the living room, when suddenly Steve said, All right then, Dad. At that moment, I felt relieved. Then I entered the living room and asked Steve. I heard voices, were you on the phone? Oh, well, yes. His vague reply puzzled me. Why would he need to hide a call with his father-in-law? It felt a bit odd, but remembering Steve pleading with his dad, I wondered if he was embarrassed to ask for help. With that thought, I stopped pressing the issue. However, just a few days later, I would regret that decision. What? Your father collapsed. Steve called me as I was about to go out to shop for dinner. Mom said it seems serious. Serious? What do you mean? We have to consider the worst-case scenario. How much do we have in savings? He seemed reluctant to speak directly. But I understood what Steve was implying. If his father passed away, there would be expenses for the funeral. I pondered for a moment and then checked my bank account. Leave this to me. You better go to your dad. Yeah, you're right. The call ended there. Meanwhile, I transferred $30,000 from the savings I had before we got married into Steve's account used for living expenses. This way, it'll be available immediately. Then I hurried to the hospital where my mother-in-law had called from about my father-in-law's admission. It will be fine. With that hope, I rushed into the hospital room. What I saw was my father-in-law laughing and talking. Shannon, you're here. Are you okay? Seeing how lively my father-in-law was, I collapsed from relief. Hey, are you all right, Shannon? Yes, it's just great to see you're doing well. Although relieved, Steve took me out of the hospital room. Then, hesitantly, Steve began to speak. Dad seems fine, but he's not really. What do you mean? I asked, and Steve started to explain bit by bit. Steve's story was this. His father had been working as a construction worker. However, he had been quite reckless since his youth. Because of that, his body was now paying the price. It looks like he collapsed all of a sudden because of the backlash. From now on, he can't overdo it. He'll need care, to the point where he can't work anymore. So, I have to support my dad and them. So, are we going to live together? That would be too much even for you, wouldn't it, Shannon? I couldn't nod in agreement face to face. But, needless to say, that's what I thought. So, I'm planning to just give them living expenses. Besides, my parents have their own house. The house and land of Steve's family home were inherited from his parents. It's old but livable. And since there's no rent, the support from Steve alone might just be enough. For the moment, I felt relieved. But then, the next moment, I heard something unbelievable. So, could you work too? What? I haven't worked in years? Just part-time, please. We're gonna struggle to make ends meet if you don't work. When you put it that way, he was right. We're not exactly living comfortably as it is. And now, the expenses for Steve's parents would be coming out of our current living expenses. It's clear that life is going to get tougher. I also need to save for Emily and Sarah's education expenses. Considering the what-ifs, it's best that I work. With that thought, I started working part-time. Was that what Steve had been asking his dad about? To not overdo it at work? Despite me saying that Dad's body was at its limit. I find myself thinking that now, albeit too late. It's too late to have regrets, but I couldn't help it. As if to add insult to injury, my mother-in-law then contacted me like this. Could you come over on your days off? Why? Caring is the daughter-in-law's job, right? When put that way, I couldn't refuse. I ended up having to take care of my father-in-law too. Thus, I became fully engaged in housework, parenting, working part-time, and now caring for my father-in-law. Needless to say, fatigue was building up. I started getting irritated over small things. But I couldn't take my irritation out on Emily and Sarah. Naturally, Steve became the target of my frustrations. Steve, let's go to your parents' house next day off. What? You're taking Emily and Sarah? That too, but it's about caring for your dad. Your mom handles it on weekdays alone. I can only help with the caregiving on weekends. So, let's care for him together during our rare days off. Although I said that, Steve ignored it. Caregiving is the wife's job. He stuck to that point. In the end, I continued caring for my father-in-law alone. This lifestyle continued for years, and eventually, Emily and Sarah didn't want to go to their grandparents' house anymore. They were too young to leave at home before, but now they might be okay to stay alone. So today, you two will stay home alone. Mom is going to take care of Grandpa. I'll take care of things at home with Sarah, Emily said cheerily. Sarah quietly nodded next to her. You three get dinner ready, okay? Can you manage that? We can handle it. No problem. Emily replied eagerly, while Sarah was more reserved. They're two very different girls, but both are good kids like me. So, I left home feeling reassured. Then I headed to my in-laws' house. And just as I arrived in front of the house, I heard my in-laws' voices from inside. That daughter-in-law really is obedient. Yeah, really a useful housekeeper. They laughed. I was shocked. To think they saw me that way, it made me a bit sad. But what they said next was even more shocking. Well, it was a mistake having her bear daughters. They're not cute like her. Right. We could have forgiven her if they were sons. Either way, a successor is necessary, right? Yes. Why don't we have that young woman Steve brought over last time to have one for us? At that moment, my eyes widened. Unnoticed, I had pressed the record button on my phone. Oblivious, my in-laws continued their conversation. That was when I first learned the truth. Steve has a younger mistress. Moreover, the claim that his father needed caregiving was a lie. His father, not wanting to work, colluded with Steve to deceive me. His father gets money without working, and Steve boldly supports his mistress. My in-laws talked about this. After the conversation ended, I rang the doorbell. How are you feeling? I asked, as if nothing was wrong. Of course, my father-in-law pretended to need care. I found it oddly amusing. Regardless, I continued to pretend I didn't know. It allowed me to gather more evidence. I endured and went along with my father-in-law's act, but collecting evidence like this, Steve eventually became suspicious. Months later, Steve confronted me, irritated. Lately, you've been neglecting the housework. What have you been doing? He was indirectly questioning me. I replied indirectly too. It would help if you pitched in. You have time on weekends, right? I am working. So am I. Don't equate part-time work with a full-time job. Steve snapped at me. At that moment, it felt like our relationship was over. On the first day of the following weekend, Steve slammed the divorce papers in front of me during a meal. You've been getting cheeky lately. Think about your position again. My position? What do you mean by that? Think for yourself a bit. With that, Steve left the house. All I could do was stand there, stunned. I stared at the divorce papers laid before me. Steve's part was already filled in. Guess he wants me to file it, then. Might as well. That was all I could think of in this situation. I hurriedly signed the divorce papers. Steve probably thought pushing the divorce papers on me would make me shrink back. Indeed, the old me might not have been able to do anything at this point. I would have pretended not to know about Steve's affair and just gone along with what he said. But I'm different now. Becoming a mother to Emily and Sarah has made me stronger. Steve has underestimated the strength of a woman who's a mother. He'd better regret his naive understanding. I tucked the signed divorce papers into my pocket with a defiant smile. For now, I have gathered evidence of Steve's affair. There's no problem in submitting the divorce papers now. The only concern is what Emily and Sarah might think. How do I explain this to them? I pondered, sighing. Just then, Emily and Sarah came over. They must have heard Steve's loud voice. They looked sad. Did something happen with Dad? Are you okay, Mom? I immediately hugged them both. As I stroked their heads, I told them the truth. I'm tired of being with your dad. So, I want us three to live together. I looked from Emily to Sarah. Emily tried to stay cheerful, while Sarah seemed downcast. Even though he's like that, he's still their father. If you two don't want this. I was prepared to endure and not divorce. But then Sarah quickly said, I don't want to transfer schools. I want to stay with my friends. I was taken aback by her words. It seemed she wasn't against the divorce after all. Emily then comforted Sarah. Try to understand how Mom feels. I don't need a dad like that either. I don't want Dad, but I don't want to transfer schools. It took a few hours before I understood what both of them really meant. Emily and Sarah were actually in favor of the divorce. In reality, since Steve wanted a son, he had been cold to them. So, as far as they were concerned, Steve didn't matter. However, there was one issue that concerned them. That was moving out due to the divorce. They believed they would have to move far away and change schools. Of course, there was no need for a school transfer. When I explained this, they were overjoyed. They started preparing for the move with great excitement. Now there are no more problems, I thought, grinning as I proceeded with the moving preparations. I also consulted a lawyer and planned to submit the divorce papers the next day. All that was left was to inform Steve that I had filed them. Why won't he answer the phone? Despite my repeated calls, Steve never picks up the phone. Nor does he seem to be coming home. Even though it's a long weekend, I wonder what he's doing and where? Well, probably with his mistress. It's infuriating, but that's fine by me. I have no feelings left for Steve anymore. First, I should say goodbye to his parents. After moving, I took Emily and Sarah and visited Steve's parents' house. However, to avoid any conflict with the in-laws, I had Emily and Sarah wait in the car. Then I alone pressed the doorbell of the in-laws' house. Soon, my mother-in-law appeared. Oh, Shannon, you came today. Hi. Come on in. My husband is waiting too. As my mother-in-law tried to usher me inside, I stopped her with my right hand. I have something to tell you today. Something else? What is it? Actually, I've decided to get a divorce. As I started to say this, my mother-in-law suddenly widened her eyes and, despite being at the doorstep, raised her voice. Are you planning to abandon your duties as a daughter-in-law? Who will take care of my husband now? I'm sorry, but that would be you. What? You expect an old woman to do it? Caregiving is your job as the daughter-in-law. No matter how loudly she objected, it was troubling. Firstly, the divorce wasn't my idea. I explained this, but my mother-in-law wouldn't understand. Are you abandoning me? Heartless. I heard my father-in-law's voice from inside. With a sigh, I went into the in-laws' house. Going to my father-in-law, I pulled out a bank statement for the household expenses from my pocket. Anyway, I've filed for divorce. So, we're no longer related. What did you say? Why would you do such a thing? That's right. Don't make decisions without consulting us. Marital issues shouldn't involve the in-laws. I thought that but figured they wouldn't listen anyway. So, I switched to the topic they were most worried about, money. I understand you're worried about living expenses. That's why I brought this. I pulled out the bank statement, which is in Steve's name. I usually use his account for our family's living expenses. But since it's in Steve's name, I can't use it anymore. It's unnecessary for me, so I decided to give it to my in-laws. Give me this month's living expenses. My mother-in-law took the bank statement. Suddenly, she went quiet. What, this is? What's the matter? My father-in-law snatched it from her. Then the two of them stared intently at it. This means we don't need a daughter-in-law. They took the bait. That's what I thought to myself. At that moment, my mother-in-law started pushing me out. If you're divorced, get out quickly. Hey! What are you doing? Get out if you're divorced. You're useless. Their attitude changed abruptly. Before I knew it, I was being kicked out of the in-laws' house. Don't ever show your face here again. With that, my mother-in-law sharply closed the door. What was that attitude? It was infuriating, but I also felt relieved. Anyway, the farewell was done. And the setup is complete. Now, with my stingy in-laws, they'll ruin themselves. I left my in-laws' house with a smirk on my face. Afterward, I went with Emily and Sarah to our newly rented condo. Our new home isn't far from where we lived before. Naturally, Emily and Sarah don't need to transfer schools. That saved me from some paperwork. A week later, during a lunch break at work, I casually picked up my phone. Suddenly, I noticed an unusually high number of missed calls. Alarmed, I hurriedly called back. Hello? Steve? It was Steve who had been trying to reach me. As soon as he answered, he yelled, "What are you doing?" What do you mean? I'm at work. When I responded nonchalantly, Steve raised his voice even more. That's not what I'm talking about. Why aren't you coming home? What? Because we're divorced? When I asked back, Steve fell silent for a moment. In a bewildered voice, he asked me, "Who got divorced?" Steve and I did. You gave me the divorce papers, remember? A week ago, it was undoubtedly Steve who had slammed the divorce papers in front of me. They were all filled out, so all I did was think it over and submit them myself. I explained this politely. Then, for some reason, Steve started to get angry. What are you thinking? Who really files for divorce just like that? But you gave them to me. Listen, that was a threat. A threat. You think a divorced woman over 40 can survive on her own? Steve's words really got to me. What was he thinking, saying something like that? Sure, living with 2 daughters is tough, but I manage because I work properly. Actually, it's easier on my body not having to care for my father-in-law anymore. When I told Steve this, he suddenly went quiet. Well, just be prepared. What? It's not out of nowhere. I have evidence of your affair. As I said this, Steve shouted again. Shut up. So that's it from my side. Then give me back my money. At that moment, I just tilted my head. I had no memory of borrowing money from Steve. What are you talking about? Playing dumb? It's about the money in the household account. Here's what Steve said. Yesterday, Steve came home after a long absence. He noticed that my belongings were gone and the house was empty. It was late at night, so he just went to sleep. This morning, on his way to work, Steve stopped at an ATM. He tried to withdraw money using the bank card from home. However, the account balance was 0. He couldn't withdraw a single cent. The card I had was for the household expenses account. So? You stole it. Give it back. That money is for my living expenses too. I could see Steve's point. But I had my counter-arguments. But I was the one providing the living expenses, right? Your money was going to your parents. Well, that might be true, but you promised to provide the living expenses. Knowing it wasn't his money, he was still demanding it from me. Well, if that's the case, I just had to state the facts. Well, the account was nearly empty, but I wasn't the last one to withdraw from it. What? Then who was it? Your father or mother? I gave them the bank information for that account. What? A few days ago, when I went to say goodbye to my in-laws, I gave them the bank statement with the information for the household expenses account. The account balance was about $60,000. Though it seemed that way. At first glance, the balance appeared to be about $60,000. But in reality, it wasn't that much. Here's the trick. When my father-in-law fell ill, I transferred $60,000. Because it was a large amount, the transaction was done at the bank. At that time, the account balance reached about $60,000. Though my father-in-law never used that money, it was intended for my living expenses. Eventually, the account's balance was almost depleted, and the actual balance was nearly zero. However, they didn't check the account and the bank statement was not up to date. So, my in-laws believed there was $60,000 in the account. They probably used it like water. I think they might even be in debt now. No way, that can't be. You'd better collect it quickly. As I was about to say more, Steve hung up. Smirking, I also hung up the phone. What happens next, I wonder? I quietly slipped my phone back into my pocket. A few hours later. While I was visiting a certain place for work. After a round of work discussions, my in-laws called me. Of course, I was at work, so I hung up, but they kept calling back. Irritated, I told them where I was and asked them not to call because I was busy, then hung up. Eventually, work ended, and I left the place alone. It was a conference room at a certain company. Later, in the lobby on the first floor, I ran into someone unexpectedly. What the? Why are you here? Oh? You were at the office, Steve. I had an appointment with Steve. Yes, the place I visited for work was Steve's company. You came to the company to complain about me? That's a nuisance. That's not true. I'm here for work. Work? There's no need for a part-time lady like you here. That really annoyed me. Then, my eyes caught a woman standing next to Steve. She was staring at me intently. Then, she suddenly said to me, Steve, do you know this person? Yeah, she's my ex-wife. But I've dumped her already. Hearing their conversation, I realized something. I thought this woman looked familiar. Smirking inwardly, I realized the woman in front of me was Steve's mistress. Actually, I had hired a private investigator a little while ago to look into Steve's behavior. Of course, because of what the in-laws told me. From the investigation, this woman was reported as the mistress. Her name was Lisa, a young woman standing right before me. Taking the opportunity, I replied sarcastically. Nice to meet you. You must be the woman Steve's cheating with. That's not true. I'm his real partner. Lisa retorted, frowning. I responded, looking away. Oh, sorry about that. What a rude woman. Steve, you should say something to her. Lisa pulled on Steve's arm. Meanwhile, Steve just nodded along foolishly. Sure, leave it to me. Hey Shannon. If you're here, then pay back the money. That topic again? I already told you. You come here on the pretext of a divorce and act all high and mighty. Steve raised his voice. I was utterly exasperated. I told him it was for work, but he really doesn't understand anything. Moreover, does he not realize what making a scene here could lead to? It seems he doesn't. Anyway, causing a commotion myself would just be a nuisance. Let's change locations for now. What? Running away when it's not in your favor? Steve taunted me. It seemed pointless to argue with him. Just as I started to think this, another woman's voice echoed in the lobby. I've found you, thief. Turning around, there was my mother-in-law. And surprisingly, my supposedly needy father-in-law, who was initially in a wheelchair, now standing up in his excitement. He raised his voice and approached me aggressively. What's this about the bank account? I thought there was money and used it, but it was empty. That's because... Shut up. It's your fault we're in debt now. You pay back the debt, thief. The in-laws' misunderstanding was as expected. Of course, they might end up in debt. I had considered that they might take responsibility on their own if it came to that. But being confronted like this was unexpected. I was too flustered to respond. Meanwhile, Steve took the opportunity to blame me. So you did steal it? Ridiculous. Yes, exactly. Steve laughed loudly. I was at a loss, biting my lip. Just then, a loud voice filled the lobby. What's all this noise, Steve? Looking towards the voice, there was the person I had been speaking with before. Seeing him, Steve quickly changed his attitude. Alan, I'm very sorry. This woman who stole my money came to the company. Steve pointed at me. Just then, the man known as Alan shouted. Don't be rude. She's an important business associate. What? This part-time lady is a business associate? Steve looked at me disdainfully, while Alan walked towards me. I apologize for my subordinate saying such outrageous things. Huh? Why? Just apologize to her. Watching this, I couldn't help but chuckle. Then I explained everything to a baffled Steve. The story goes back quite a bit. When I started working part-time, I chose a certain factory. It was a cosmetics factory, and I decided to work in quality control there. Of course, I had a reason for choosing that role. Actually, I had worked in cosmetics development before getting married. I have a deep understanding of cosmetics. Proud of that, I chose this job. One day while I was working, the female CEO who came for an inspection noticed me. It turned out she had worked at the cosmetics manufacturer where I used to work. She was impressed by the cosmetics I had developed there. So, she started her own cosmetics company. Realizing that I had greatly influenced her, she immediately approached me. Then, she recruited me to her company's product development department. So, I'm now a full-time employee. I even manage product development. No way! It's true. That's why it's like this. I pointed at Steve. Steve tearfully regretted his actions. I apologize. He will be disciplined. That would be good. Could you take care of that woman too? That would be Lisa, right? Alan glanced at Lisa. As soon as she noticed his gaze, Lisa started to panic. She had an affair with my former husband and insulted another person. That's not true. I am. Excuses are useless. Think about how many people were around. There were about 10 people in the lobby, including people from outside the company. Some of them were even recording the scene. Oh no! Lisa collapsed. I walked past her. Before leaving the company, I made a point to my in-laws. Making a scene in a company can lead to serious consequences. Hope you can afford the damages. Smiling slightly, my in-laws looked down guiltily. Later, as one might expect, the commotion spread to relevant parties. However, Alan worked hard to prevent the video from leaking. Thanks to his efforts, it didn't turn into a scandal online. Nevertheless, Steve did not escape responsibility. He wasn't fired, but he was moved to a less critical position. Lisa was transferred to a regional branch. Moreover, my in-laws were sued for damages by the company. But they couldn't afford to pay. Even selling their house and land wasn't enough. They also had debts and couldn't do anything about it. Eventually, they begged Steve for help. Steve's severance pay was also used to settle the damages. Of course, when my lawyer heard about this, he immediately demanded alimony. Thanks to that, I received the divorce settlement while Steve still had his severance pay. However, because my in-laws' debt repayment was outstanding, Steve and his family are now doing day labor. I also demanded alimony from Lisa, but her parents paid it on her behalf. Lisa is now seriously working to pay them back. As for me, I'm thriving in my new full-time role at the new workplace. Since it's the same field, it feels natural to work there without any caregiving responsibilities. Now, on weekends, I can take Emily and Sarah out. Which brings a natural smile to my face when I see how happy they are. Because of these two, I can keep pushing forward. Though my marriage was a failure, it brought something valuable. Emily and Sarah are treasures. Whenever I watch them go to school, I feel strongly about this.